We're stepping into the misty Yorkshire countryside today, where old stone towers whisper secrets and chilling legends hide something far more human and far more dangerous. But before we dive into the story, I want to know something from you. Where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop it in the comments. I always love seeing how far our little storytelling family reaches. And hey, don't forget to tap that like button. Your support truly keeps this journey alive, and it means more to me than you know. Now, take a moment, grab yourself a cup of tea, Yorkshire tea if you've got it, and settle in. Because together, we are about to peel back the layers of a mystery that begins with a single telegram. The Murder of Crispin Grimsby. Chapter 1. The Summons from Yorkshire. It was a gray Tuesday morning in late October when the message arrived. A simple telegram, but one that would pull my friend Hercule Poirot and me straight into one of the most puzzling, unforgettable cases we ever faced. I was in the middle of a slow, easy breakfast at our flat in Whitehaven Mansions when George, Poirot's perfectly polished valet, came in with a quiet knock. In his calm, respectful way, he placed a familiar yellow envelope on the silver tray beside Poirot's neatly stacked morning letters. "A telegram for you, sir," he said softly. Poirot, as usual, was focused on his morning ritual, sipping his rich hot chocolate and nibbling delicately on his croissants, each bite taken with his trademark precision. He didn't rush. He never did. With a slight lift of his eyebrows, he carefully dabbed his mustache with a napkin before reaching for the envelope with those perfectly kept fingers of his. "Ah, Hastings," he murmured after scanning the short message. "How curious. It seems we have been summoned to Yorkshire." "Yorkshire?" I muttered, setting my coffee cup down a little harder than I meant to. "Not exactly the best time of year for a trip north, wouldn't you say?" "Indeed, mon ami," Poirot replied calmly, "but listen to this." He cleared his throat and began to read aloud from the telegram. "Urgent. Brother murdered in Bloody Tower. Police baffled by supernatural circumstances. Require your immediate assistance. Signed, Nigel Grimsby, Grimswood Grange, Yorkshire. I nearly choked on my toast. Supernatural circumstances? I say, Poirot, you're not seriously thinking of chasing after ghost stories and nonsense like that, are you?" Poirot's gray eyes gleamed strangely as he folded the telegram with his usual careful precision. "Ghosts, Hastings? No, Poirot does not believe in such things. But murder?" He gave a small, deliberate smile. "Murder, my friend, is always natural, always human. And where there is murder," Poirot added with a knowing smile, "there are always the little gray cells ready to solve the puzzle." "But this fellow mentioned supernatural circumstances," I argued. "Sounds like pure nonsense to me." "Exactly, mon ami, précisément." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "And that is what makes it so very interesting. When someone wishes Poirot to believe in ghosts, it is because they are hiding something very real indeed. So despite my protests about chasing phantoms across the Yorkshire moors, I still found myself that same afternoon sitting beside Poirot in a first-class railway carriage. Together, we watched the suburbs of London slowly fade into bare fields and lonely villages as the countryside grew more bleak with every passing mile. By the time we reached our destination, The October sky hung low and gray, and a thin drizzle had begun to fall. Grimswood Grange rose before us like something out of a Gothic romance. Its ancient stones blackened by rain and centuries of age. The Tudor-style main house spread across its manicured grounds, but it was the looming medieval tower that caught the eye, dominating everything around it like a dark sentinel. The tower rose from a slight hill, 100 yards or so from the main house. Round, ancient, and built of heavy stone, it loomed over the estate with a presence that felt almost hostile. "Good Lord," I muttered, pulling my coat tighter around me as we stepped down from the motor car that had collected us at the station. "Rather gives one the shivers, doesn't it?" Poirot, of course, was unruffled. His sharp eyes studied every inch of the scene before us. The tower, the grounds, the house itself. "Most atmospheric, certainly," he said lightly. "But notice, Hastings, the windows are well kept, the gardens neatly trimmed. This is no place of poverty. Whatever troubles Monsieur Nigel Grimsby has, they are not due to neglect." I opened my mouth to ask how on earth he had deduced financial difficulties from a single telegram, but the thought was cut short. The heavy oak door of the manor creaked open, and a man stepped out to greet us. Nigel Grimsby appeared to be in his early 30s, tall, clean-cut, and dressed smartly in country tweeds. Yet despite his polished appearance, his nerves betrayed him. His dark hair was perfectly combed, but his hands shook slightly, and the smile he offered us was strained. "Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings," he said quickly, relief heavy in his voice. "Thank heaven you came so promptly." His voice carried the polished tone of a man raised in privilege, but beneath it ran a thread of raw strain. "I confess, I hardly knew where else to turn," he admitted. "The local police are completely at a loss, and the circumstances, well, they're beyond anything ordinary." "Mr. Grimsby," Poirot said softly, inclining his head with great formality, "permit me to offer my condolences for the loss of your brother. You have my assurance. Hercule Poirot will do everything possible to uncover the truth." "Truth?" Nigel gave a short, bitter laugh. "I'm not even sure what that word means anymore. But come, you must see the tower where it happened. Though perhaps after your long journey, you'd care for some refreshment first." We followed him through the heavy doorway into the manor. Inside, the air was rich with history. The furniture was fine, clearly valuable antiques, but a little too worn at the edges, as though the family were keeping up appearances while money quietly slipped away. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors glared down at us from the paneled walls, their painted eyes seeming to judge all who passed. And everywhere, there was that faint sense of grandeur fraying at the seams. Everywhere we looked, there was evidence of a heritage stretching back for centuries. "Your family has held this estate for some time, I see," Poirot remarked as we were led into a comfortable sitting room, where a great fire crackled warmly in the enormous stone hearth. "Since 1487, Nigel replied with a flicker of pride. 20 generations of Grimsbys have called Grimswood Grange their home." He hesitated, his voice catching slightly as he went on. "My brother Crispin was, yes, was, the 21st. For a moment, the silence seemed to echo with that correction. Then he drew a breath and gestured toward the window, where the looming silhouette of the tower could be seen through the drizzle. and the tower where it happened. The Bloody Tower, as we've always called it. It was built in the 14th century as part of the original fortifications. Its history is grim, to say the least. More than one death has stained its stones over the centuries, including that of Lady Constance Grimsby in the year 1598. Since then, Nigel continued, lowering his voice, there have been sightings. I noticed Poirot's mustache give the faintest twitch, whether from amusement or genuine interest. I couldn't quite tell. Sightings of what nature, monsieur? He asked. Nigel's eyes drifted toward the mullioned windows, where the ancient tower loomed dark and brooding against the gray sky. When he spoke again, it was barely more than a whisper. The Grey Lady, Monsieur Poirot. They say she walks the battlements whenever tragedy is about to strike our family. And 3 nights ago, she was seen again. The fire seemed to burn lower at his words, and despite myself, I edged my chair closer to the warmth. Chapter 2. The Household at Grimswood Grange. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the Yorkshire air carrying that sharp bite of approaching winter. I found Poirot already dressed the next morning, standing over the breakfast table with his usual meticulous focus. An old plan of the estate was spread out before him, its corners carefully pinned down with the salt cellar and sugar bowl, as though no detail, however small, could be left unattended. "Ah, Hastings, you are awake at last," he observed, without so much as glancing up. "Regard this plan. It is most instructive." He tapped the parchment lightly. "See here, the tower. She stands quite apart from the main house, connected only by this gravel path. So isolated, n'est-ce pas?" "Rather," I agreed, helping myself to a plate of kippers from the sideboard. "But I say, Poirot, shouldn't we be examining the scene of the crime first thing?" "Patience, my friend." He raised a finger in quiet emphasis. "First, Poirot must understand the people. The tower, she will wait. She has waited for centuries already. But people, they change. They forget small details, or they twist them into something they wish to believe. No. The tower is silent, but the household, they will speak." At precisely 9 o'clock, Nigel Grimsby appeared, looking better composed than the night before, though the faint tremor in his hands betrayed his nerves as he lit his morning cigarette. "I've arranged for you to meet everyone this morning," he announced. "My sister-in-law, Serafina, is in the morning room," Nigel began. "Dr. Thorne is in his study, as always, and Jenkins is about his duties. Where would you prefer to start?" "With the lady of the house, if you please," Poirot replied, folding the estate plan with his usual precision. "It is always most instructive to understand the domestic arrangements." Serafina Grimsby was not at all what I had pictured. Striking, yes, but not in the ordinary sense of beauty. She carried an almost otherworldly grace, like a figure from a pre-Raphaelite painting. Tall and willowy, with auburn hair that glowed warmly in the sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the morning room. She seemed to move with an effortless elegance. Her pale blue dress floated softly around her as she crossed the room. Yet her gray eyes told another story. Depths of feeling kept carefully under control, like emotions pressed beneath glass. "Mr. Poirot," she said, extending a slender hand. Nigel tells me you've come to help us understand what happened to poor Crispin. I must admit, the whole affair has left me quite bewildered. Poirot bowed formally over her hand. Madame Grimsby, permit me to offer my deepest sympathy for your loss. Your husband, he had been in good health recently? Oh yes, quite robust for a man of 43, she replied, settling gracefully into a silk-covered chair, every movement measured and precise. Crispin was always careful with his constitution. He made a point of taking long walks around the estate each evening, said it cleared his mind for his business affairs. Ah yes, business affairs, Poirot said gently. Your husband, he was much occupied with such matters, was he not? A shadow crossed Seraphina's delicate features. More and more so, I'm afraid. These past months, he seemed constantly preoccupied, always shut away in his study, with piles of correspondence and ledgers. At times, her voice softened. I felt as though I scarcely knew him anymore. I noticed Poirot's keen attention to this confession. Though his face betrayed nothing beyond his usual polite calm. And on the evening of the tragedy, madame, where were you? He asked. I took my usual walk in the gardens after dinner, she replied. The house feels oppressive at night. So many shadows, so many memories. The fresh air, it soothes me. She lifted one pale hand to her throat. I wore my gray shawl. It was a chilly October evening. After taking our leave of Lady Grimsby, Nigel led us down a winding maze of corridors until we reached Dr. Silas Thorne's study. The room was a bibliophile's paradise. Every wall packed from floor to ceiling with books. Ancient volumes and cracked leather bindings leaned against rows of newer academic texts. The air thick with the musty perfume of old paper and the lingering scent of pipe tobacco. Dr. Silas Thorne was a man in his early 50s, with the slightly stooped posture of someone who had spent a lifetime hunched over manuscripts and books. His neatly trimmed gray beard framed a thoughtful face, and behind his wire-rimmed spectacles, his eyes carried the sharp, restless intelligence of a scholar forever chasing knowledge. When we entered, he was bent intently over what looked like a medieval manuscript, examining its faded pages through a magnifying glass. Dr. Thorne, Nigel announced. These are the gentlemen I mentioned, Monsieur Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings. The historian looked up at once, setting aside his work with careful reverence before rising to greet us. Mr. Poirot, he exclaimed warmly, what an honor! I've followed your cases for years, with the greatest interest, I assure you. Such precision, such method in unraveling the mysteries of human behavior. Poirot inclined his head modestly. You are too kind, Doctor. I understand you are something of an authority on the history of this estate? Indeed, Thorne replied, his face lighting up. For over 20 years, I've been cataloging the Grimsby family records. Every document, every legend, every tradition. It is fascinating work. Why, the Grey Lady herself appears in written accounts as far back as the late 16th century. Most intriguing, Poirot murmured, his tone calm, but his eyes keen. And tell me, Doctor, have you ever witnessed this apparition yourself? At once, Doctor. Thorne's expression brightened with the eager intensity of a man who lives for discovery. Not until very recently, he admitted, voice low with a mixture of awe and certainty. But 3 nights ago, the very night poor Crispin met his fate, I saw something I cannot explain. A figure, pale and gray, gliding along the battlements of the tower. It was no trick of the light, I assure you. Quite unmistakable. And you were alone when you made this observation? Poirot pressed gently. Entirely, Thorne confirmed, smoothing his beard with absent fingers. I often take solitary walks late in the evening, especially when wrestling with some stubborn historical puzzle. The night air has a way of sharpening the mind, clearing away the clutter. But that night, the clarity it brought me was of quite a different kind. Our final encounter of the morning was with Jenkins, the butler, whom we found in the pantry, polishing silver with a precision that seemed almost mechanical, the rhythm of long habit. He was a man near 60, his posture still stiff with the discipline of a former soldier. His face revealed little, trained into the discretion expected of a perfect servant. Yet in his pale blue eyes there lingered something. Was it a spark of resentment long buried, or simply the quiet fatigue of a life spent in service? Nigel, Poirot began, his tone polite but steady. I should like to have a word with Jenkins about the evening of your brother's passing. Nigel shifted uncomfortably, as though even the mention of the butler in this context unsettled him. Very well, he said at last. Turning to the servant, he added, Jenkins, Mr. Poirot wishes to speak with you. Of course, sir. Jenkins's reply came with the practiced composure of a man who had long ago learned to guard his tone. His face revealed nothing, his voice carefully balanced, each word measured like the polish he applied to silver. I attended to Sir Crispin at dinner, he began, his hands clasped neatly behind his back. At precisely 8 o'clock, as always, he appeared unsettled, though he did not confide the cause. There was a restlessness about him. He kept glancing toward the windows, as though expecting someone or something to arrive. Poirot's eyes narrowed with quiet curiosity. And when you served the second course? Jenkins dipped his head slightly. He asked if there had been any callers that day. I assured him there had not. He gave no reply, but the doubt lingered in his expression, as though he believed I had overlooked something. And you yourself? Poirot asked, his voice gentle yet probing. Your movements that night? As is my custom, I secured the house before retiring to my quarters at 9. Jenkins said evenly, I heard nothing unusual through the night. Nothing at all. When our questioning was done, Nigel led us back toward our rooms. My mind churned with uncertainty. Every account we had heard seemed reasonable enough, yet none quite settled in my thoughts. The household offered explanations that fit together neatly on the surface. Too neatly, perhaps. And somewhere beneath those polished answers, I felt, lay the truth still waiting to be uncovered. Yet despite all the neat explanations we had been given, something about the entire business felt off. A thread of unease ran beneath every word, every gesture. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew Poirot had already noticed what I had missed. He didn't look puzzled in the least. Instead, there was that familiar spark in his gray eyes, the quiet gleam I had learned to recognize as the beginning of his mental process. He stopped outside his chamber, one hand resting on the polished brass handle, and said softly, Most instructive, Hastings. Most instructive indeed. Do you not see? Here we have a household where everyone chooses to walk alone after dinner, where the master dines with fear in his eyes, and where the dead, it seems, rise to pace the battlements. He let the words hang for a moment before adding with calm certainty, "Tomorrow, mon ami, we shall examine the tower itself, the place where impossibilities are made to appear possible." Chapter 3: The Bloody Tower's Secret. The next morning greeted us with a sharp chill, the kind of cold that crept into one's bones. Poirot and I set out across the gravel path, our footsteps crunching in the stillness as we approached the infamous Bloody Tower. Even in full daylight, the place was unsettling. Its ancient stones, damp from the night's frost, seemed to hold centuries of secrets. The round tower rose a good 60 feet into the bleak Yorkshire sky, its jagged battlements cutting a grim silhouette against the low-hanging clouds. Poirot halted, his keen gaze sweeping over every detail. "Voila," he murmured, his voice low, almost reverent. "Here, Hastings, we stand at the heart of the mystery." "Here we stand, Hastings," Poirot said quietly, his eyes fixed on the looming tower. "The stage of our so-called impossible crime, a locked room mystery in the purest sense, or so at least it appears." Dr. Thorne accompanied us, brimming with his usual scholarly energy. His voice carried a hint of pride as he gestured toward the base of the tower, his breath curling into the frosty morning air. "This structure dates back to around 1380, he explained. "It was once part of the estate's defenses, though for the past 200 years it has served more as a symbol than a fortress." As we drew nearer, I began to understand why the local police had been utterly confounded. The great oak door looked as though it belonged to another age, its thick planks bound with heavy iron bands, the hinges wide and brutal, ready to withstand a siege. At some point, a modern mortise lock had been installed, but the original medieval system remained intact. A massive iron bar that could be lowered into brackets on either side of the frame, sealing the door from within. Dr. Thorne reached into his coat and produced a large brass key, polished from years of handling. "When the police forced their way inside," he said, "they found not only the lock engaged, but the inner bar firmly set in place. Quite impossible for anyone outside to manage, as you see." Poirot crouched slightly, his expression focused, almost tender, as if the door itself were a witness waiting to speak. His small, careful fingers traced the edges of the lock and the old iron fittings, studying every detail with the patience of a craftsman and the precision of a surgeon. "Most interesting," murmured Poirot, his eyes narrowing. "And this key, Doctor? Who normally had possession of it?" Dr. Thorne straightened slightly, the brass key still in his hand. "Sir Crispin himself. He kept it along with the keys to all the estate's historical buildings. It was part of his duty as head of the family." "Oh, silence." Poirot gave a small nod, his voice low and deliberate. "Précisément. And where was this particular key when the body was found?" Dr. Thorne hesitated for the briefest moment. "Still in Sir Crispin's pocket. That, I'm afraid, is yet another baffling detail." With that, he inserted the key into the great iron lock. The mechanism turned with a deep, grinding resistance, as though centuries of use weighed on its every movement. A heavy groan echoed through the chill air as the oak door swung inward, its hinges protesting like an old man roused from long slumber. The tower's interior lay before us, a circular chamber, 20 feet across at most, its rough stone walls climbing unbroken to a vaulted ceiling nearly 15 feet overhead. A spiral staircase of ancient stone curled tightly up the wall, vanishing into shadow, leading to upper rooms and, no doubt, the battlements. Thin shafts of daylight filtered in through narrow arrow slits, the pale beams cutting through the gloom, but doing little to ease its oppressive weight. The air smelled of damp stone and age, as though the centuries themselves still lingered here. Dr. Thorne's voice broke the silence. "The body was discovered here," he said, gesturing to a stark patch of floor at the chamber's center. Sir Crispin had been found lying flat on his back, a dagger driven deep into his chest. What unsettled the police most, there were no signs of struggle at all. Poirot, of course, had already slipped into his element. He moved slowly around the chamber's edge, with that peculiar, deliberate gait of his, part dancer, part detective. At times, he crouched to study the floor with his magnifying glass. At others, he let his fingertips brush lightly across the ancient stones, as if the walls themselves might whisper their secrets. Without lifting his gaze, he asked, "You mentioned, Doctor, that the dagger was from the estate's collection." Dr. Thorne clasped his hands behind his back, his voice steady. "Yes, a 15th century piece. Part of our medieval weaponry display. It vanished from the museum room 3 days before the murder, though its absence wasn't noticed until the following morning." "Most convenient timing," Poirot remarked dryly. "And the museum, it is secured?" "Locked each evening, certainly. But all family members hold keys, as do I, even Jenkins. We've often had visiting scholars who require access." I could feel my frustration growing as I watched Poirot's painstaking routine. To me, the chamber was exactly what it appeared to be: ancient, damp, and more than a little oppressive. Yet my friend lingered over every corner, every shadow, as though the truth itself was written there in invisible ink. "Hastings," Poirot's voice snapped me from my thoughts. He was kneeling near the base of the staircase, his magnifying glass glinting in the dim light. "Observe here. What do you see?" I crossed the chamber and peered down at the flagstones he indicated. To my eyes, it looked no different from the rest of the floor. Cold, gray, and stubbornly ordinary. The stone flags beneath our feet were worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, their surface blanketed in a fine coat of dust. I squinted, then shook my head. "I'm afraid I see nothing remarkable, Poirot. Just dust and old stones." "Mais non, mon ami," he said softly, his voice tinged with quiet satisfaction. "Look closer. Here. Do you not see the faint disturbances in the dust? And here, these subtle scratches carved into the stone itself." I leaned in, but the signs were all but invisible to me. To my eyes, it was the same lifeless floor as before. Dr. Thorne, however, bent forward eagerly, his scholarly curiosity instantly awakened. "Extraordinary," he breathed. I've spent countless hours in this very chamber, cataloging carvings, inscriptions, and architectural details, and yet I cannot recall ever noticing those particular marks. Poirot's mustache twitched ever so slightly. Tell me, Doctor, when was the last time you examined this section with true care? Thorne hesitated, adjusting his spectacles. Months, at the very least. My recent focus has been the upper rooms, their construction, their connection to the legend of the Grey Lady. Meanwhile, Poirot moved on with his slow, deliberate circuit of the chamber. He devoted special attention to the edges, where the stone floor met the walls. At one point, he lingered for nearly 10 minutes at what seemed, to me at least, a perfectly ordinary patch of medieval masonry. His small hands traced the mortar lines with meticulous care, as though the stones themselves were holding their breath. Dr. Thorne, half speaking to himself, began to explain as we watched. The construction of these walls was remarkably advanced for their time. Nearly 4 feet thick, designed to repel both siege weapons and centuries of weather. And often, he paused, lowering his voice. The builders incorporated concealed chambers or passages for strategic purposes. Hidden passages? I blurted, unable to contain my surprise. You mean there could be another way in or out of this room? Thorne gave a grave nod. It is not only possible, Captain. It is likely. Many medieval towers were built with such clever features, Dr. Thorne remarked, his voice carrying the tone of a lecturer sharing a secret with his students. Escape routes, hidden storage rooms, even concealed stairways. But in all my years studying this place, I've never uncovered any proof of such passages here. Poirot, however, seemed unconvinced. He had drifted toward the narrow slit windows, running his fingertips lightly along the stone edges before pressing against them, testing with almost delicate care. The openings themselves were no wider than a man's handspan, barely enough for a cat to squeeze through, and set high, nearly 8 feet above the floor. Even if they were larger, I observed, glancing down at the dizzying drop beyond, no one could have escaped that way without breaking their neck. Poirot gave a small nod, eyes still fixed on the stonework. Precisely. These apertures have never been widened or altered, none? They remain as the builders intended, arrow slits, meant for defense, not for freedom. Nearly an hour passed as he continued his careful inspection, moving from wall to wall with that patient intensity I had come to both admire and dread. At last, he straightened, flicking dust from the immaculate crease of his trousers. His expression was not triumphant, but thoughtful. That subtle, inward look I had learned to recognize as a sign that his little gray cells had begun their silent dance. Most instructive, he murmured, half to himself. This tower, she keeps her secrets well. But not all of them are whispers of the supernatural, I think. At that, Dr. Thorne's scholarly eyes gleamed. You've uncovered something about the legend of the Grey Lady, haven't you? Poirot's mustache twitched as he gave the faintest of smiles. Perhaps, Doctor, perhaps. But before legends, one must first honor the evidence. Stones, they do not lie as men do. They bear witness. Silent but faithful, we left the tower together, stepping back into the fading daylight on our way toward the main house. My thoughts churned restlessly. The so-called locked room puzzle appeared utterly impossible. Yet Poirot's manner, calm and quietly assured, suggested he had noticed something I had entirely missed. And that realization unsettled me more than the gloom of the tower itself. The autumn wind rose as we made our way across the estate grounds, carrying with it the dry rustle of leaves that skittered over the gravel path like restless spirits. Behind us, the bloody tower loomed darkly against the dull, iron-gray sky, an immovable sentinel clutching its secrets as it had for centuries. Chapter 4: The Night of Shadows. The following afternoon found Poirot in one of his most deliberate moods. His methodical precision was on full display as he arranged for private interviews with each member of the household, determined to reconstruct with exactness the pattern of that ill-fated night. I admit, his painstaking approach often tried my patience, but long acquaintance had taught me that behind his fussy manner, those famed little gray cells were always at work, weaving order from chaos. "Voyez-vous, Hastings," he explained as we settled into the library, its oak shelves heavy with the dust of generations. "A murder does not arrive like lightning from a clear sky. No, it is the last stroke in a chain of events. To see clearly, we must not only know what happened, but also when and in what sequence." Our first visitor was Mrs. Seraphina Grimsby. She drifted into the room with the same air of quiet elegance I had noticed the day before. Clad in a gown of deep blue wool that framed her auburn hair with striking effect, she carried herself with the unconscious poise of a woman long accustomed to the gaze of others. "Mrs. Grimsby," Poirot began with his usual old-world courtesy, "I must ask you to look back 3 nights ago. Will you recount for us the details of that evening as precisely as you are able?" She lowered herself into a high-backed chair with careful grace, smoothing the folds of her skirt with hands that trembled ever so slightly. "I shall try, Monsieur Poirot," she said softly, "though I confess, the entire affair feels dreamlike, as though wrapped in a veil of unreality." She paused, composing herself, then continued. "Dinner was served promptly at 8, as always. Sir Crispin seemed distracted, preoccupied, though he offered no explanation and said little throughout the meal." "Preoccupied in what way, madam?" Poirot asked gently. Mrs. Grimsby's brows furrowed as she recalled. "He kept glancing toward the windows, as though waiting for someone. When Jenkins brought in the port, Crispin even asked whether any messages or visitors had arrived. It struck me as odd, very odd, for we rarely receive callers in the evening." She drew in a quiet breath before continuing. "After dinner, as usual, Crispin retired to his study. I remained in the drawing room for perhaps half an hour, but the weight of the house pressed in on me. At night, with its long corridors and heavy shadows, it can feel suffocating, filled with memories that refuse to sleep. So I chose to take my evening walk." Poirot leaned forward ever so slightly, his gaze sharpening with curiosity. "Your walk, madame, can you describe it in detail?" "Of course, I always follow the same path," she replied with careful precision. "Through the rose garden, along the ornamental lake, and back by way of the herb garden. The circuit takes about 45 minutes. Her hand rose almost unconsciously to her throat, brushing against her skin. I wore my gray cashmere shawl that night. It was a wedding gift from Crispin's aunt. Scottish, finely made, and wonderfully warm against the Yorkshire chill. Poirot's eyebrows lifted a fraction, though his face remained pleasant, almost bland. This gray shawl, it is a favorite of yours, madame? Oh yes, she answered with a faint smile. I wear it often. The color flatters me, and the fabric is a comfort in the damp evening air. Poirot's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. And during your walk, did you notice anything unusual? Perhaps near the tower? At this, Mrs. Grimsby hesitated. Her composure wavered, the faintest tremor entering her voice. I did see something strange. As I passed the tower grounds, I noticed a figure, grayish, moving along the battlements. At first, I thought it might be mist, but no, the shape was too solid, too deliberate. It unsettled me deeply. Poirot's tone softened. At what time precisely would this have been? Around 9:30, perhaps a few minutes later. The sight frightened me. I turned back at once and returned to the house. When Mrs. Grimsby had withdrawn, silence lingered for a moment. Then the door opened and Nigel entered, his face pale and drawn, his eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. He looked far more haggard than when we had first met him. Nigel's hands shook as he lit a cigarette, the flame flickering against his strained expression. His usual polish was gone, tie slightly askew, cuffs undone, as if grief had worn through his careful exterior. Poirot's tone softened. Nigel, mon ami, you understand we must speak of the evening your brother died. I know it pains you, but it is necessary. Of course. Nigel's voice was steady on the surface, but I caught the tension beneath, like a taut wire ready to snap. I spent the evening in the estate office, he explained, taking a drag from his cigarette. Crispin had asked me to look over some financial documents, correspondence, accounts, that sort of thing. Matters of the estate. Poirot's eyes narrowed just slightly. These documents, they concerned what, precisely? A flush crept slowly up Nigel's neck. Various investments, property matters. Crispin was meticulous about these things, always thorough. His hands shook more visibly now as the ash fell to the floor. And you worked alone in the office, monsieur? Poirot pressed gently. Yes, until about 10 o'clock. After that, I went to my room with a book. He hesitated, visibly wrestling with his conscience before adding, I should tell you, Crispin had been unsettled lately. Business pressures. He felt we might soon face hard choices about the estate's future. Poirot leaned forward, his eyes brightening with interest. What sort of choices, monsieur? Nothing definite, Nigel said quickly, almost too quickly. Discussions only. How to preserve the estate. How to balance tradition with practical necessity. My brother loved this family's legacy, but he wasn't blind to reality. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of Nigel's words. Our next meeting was with Jenkins, the ever-loyal valet. He entered with his usual military stiffness, shoulders squared, his manner neat to the point of ceremony. Yet I noticed it, a flicker of emotion beneath the polished exterior. the kind of heaviness a soldier carries long after battle. Poirot regarded him kindly. "Jenkins, you were the one to serve Sir Crispin his last dinner. Tell me, how did he seem to you that night?" The old valet's voice, though controlled, betrayed the faintest tremor. "Agitated, sir, if I may say so. Restless in a way I had rarely seen. Sir Crispin, as Jenkins explained, was usually a man of steady habits, predictable as the ticking of a clock. But on that final evening, something in him had shifted. His calm had been replaced with a nervous expectancy, as though he were waiting for something or someone." "In what way, Jenkins?" Poirot asked gently, tilting his head with quiet curiosity. "He asked me several times whether there had been callers, sir, or if any messages had come for him. I assured him there were none, but he didn't seem satisfied. He also pressed me about the household's routines. Who would be outside? Who might be moving about the grounds?" Poirot's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Très curieux. And your own movements that night?" "Dinner was served at 8, as always. I cleared away just after 9. Then I made my rounds and locked up the house. By 1:15, I had retired to my quarters." Here, Jenkins hesitated, his eyes flicking briefly toward Nigel before returning to Poirot. "I ought to mention, sir, as I was securing the front door, I observed Mrs. Grimsby returning from her walk. She looked unsettled, distressed even. This detail seemed to hang in the air, adding another layer to the already tangled web. From there, Dr. Thorne offered his own recollection, his eagerness to discuss the matter bordering on scholarly excitement despite the grim context. Adjusting his spectacles, he leaned forward, his voice almost trembling with enthusiasm. "I was in my study for most of the evening," he began, "immersed in manuscripts about the Grey Lady legend. Rare material, you understand. At about 9:45, I stepped out for a walk. I often do when the mind grows tired." "And naturally," Poirot prompted, "your path led you toward the tower." Dr. Thorne nodded. "Indeed. I thought to study the battlements in the moonlight, purely for atmospheric context, you see. But what I witnessed was beyond any research. A figure, gray, luminous almost, moving across the upper level of the tower. Its motions were too fluid to be human. Floating, gliding, exactly as the family accounts describe." Poirot leaned in slightly, his mustache twitching with restrained interest. "And the time, monsieur?" "Quite certain," Thorne replied firmly. "The church bell had just struck 10 when I first saw it. I watched for several minutes before it faded into the night. When at last the interviews concluded, we retired to our rooms. Yet sleep was the furthest thing from my mind. The accounts aligned neatly on paper, each person's timing precise, each observation noted. And still, the whole affair gnawed at me. Something felt wrong. Deeply, undeniably wrong." Poirot did not seem the least bit unsettled, though I confess my own thoughts were tangled in confusion. He stood quietly at the window of our sitting room, his silhouette framed against the fading evening light. Beyond the glass, the bloody tower loomed, its dark outline etched starkly against the restless sky. "Curious, Hastings. Very curious indeed," he murmured, his gaze never leaving that foreboding structure. We have here several witnesses to this so-called Gray Lady, each sighting occurring at a slightly different time. We have a victim who clearly expected some unwelcome visitor, a brother, nervous about matters of business, and an entire household where, it seems, everyone chooses to walk alone in the shadows of night. He turned then, and I caught the gleam in his gray-green eyes, that particular spark I had come to recognize as the very first stirring of his deductions. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we shall peel back the layers of these mysteries. But tonight, mon ami, we would do well to keep our windows fastened and our ears sharp. For if the Gray Lady is truly restless, she may walk again." Chapter 5. The Missing Dagger. The third morning at Grimswood Grange arrived shrouded in bluster and gloom. The wind moaned against the ancient window panes, rattling them in their casings, while brittle autumn leaves scraped across the gravel paths outside like whispers fleeing from the tower's shadow. I discovered Poirot already at work, seated with perfect posture at the writing desk, his small, neat script marching across several sheets of cream stationery. He looked up only briefly, pen still poised. Hastings. Bon matin. I have been making inquiries into the late Sir Crispin's business dealings. Très révélateur. Most revealing, I think you will find. Business affairs? I echoed, reaching for the breakfast tray. The cook, I noted, had not allowed tragedy to disrupt her high standards. The eggs were perfectly done, the coffee hot and strong. Surely you don't imagine this whole affair is tied up with ledgers and investments? This doesn't feel like some common commercial dispute. Poirot gave one of his small, maddeningly confident smiles. Patience, Hastings. The little gray cells require order, and order takes time. All will reveal itself in its proper sequence. But before we chase shadows in account books, we must first examine something more tangible. The dagger, the very weapon that struck the fatal blow. A blade, Hastings. She can speak. She can tell us of the hand that held her, and the mind that planned. An hour later, we crossed the long stone corridors to the estate's private museum, a relic in itself, tucked into what had once been the Elizabethan wing. Here, artifacts of centuries past lay preserved behind glass and oak, their presence heavy with history and perhaps with secrets. The museum occupied several long galleries on the ground floor of the manor, each chamber steeped in history and arranged with the kind of meticulous care that spoke of genuine scholarship. Generations of Grimsby artifacts, portraits, letters, relics, and treasures were preserved here, a silent chronicle of the family's centuries-old legacy. An hour later, we crossed the long stone corridors to the estate's private museum, a relic in itself, tucked into what had once been the Elizabethan wing. Here, artifacts of centuries past lay preserved behind glass and oak, their presence heavy with history and perhaps with secrets. The museum occupied several long galleries on the ground floor of the manor, each chamber steeped in history and arranged with the kind of meticulous care that spoke of genuine scholarship. Generations of Grimsby artifacts, portraits, letters, relics, and treasures were preserved here, a silent chronicle of the family's centuries-old legacy. At the entrance, we were greeted by Mrs. Penelope Whitmore, the curator. She was a slight, bird-like woman in her mid-50s, with sharp, steel-gray hair drawn tightly into a bun, and spectacles that perpetually slid askew upon her nose. Her hands flitted nervously as she spoke, like small, restless birds in flight, betraying an unease that seemed rooted in something deeper than professional duty. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quickly, her voice carrying the precise tones of educated Yorkshire gentry. "I do so hope you can make sense of this dreadful affair. I've tended this collection faithfully for 15 years, and never has anything like this occurred. Not even remotely." Poirot inclined his head with his customary courtesy, his voice gentle but probing. "Madame Whitmore, it is my understanding that you yourself discovered the dagger's absence the morning after the tragedy?" "Yes, precisely." She clasped her hands tightly to still their fluttering. "I arrived promptly, as always, at 8 o'clock to prepare the museum for Dr. Thorne's research session. As I began dusting the medieval weaponry display, I saw it at once. The gap. The Grimsby ceremonial dagger, gone. She led us down a sequence of rooms where ancestral faces stared out from varnished portraits, where time-worn manuscripts rested under glass, and where carefully labeled artifacts whispered of battles, feasts, and funerals long past. Finally, we entered the third gallery, where the medieval armory was housed in an imposing oak and glass case. Mrs. Whitmore halted, her hand trembling slightly as she gestured. "Here." Her finger indicated a velvet-lined recess between a massive battle axe and a cruel morning star. "The dagger belonged here, point downward, handle uppermost, displayed just as the other pieces are. It was a 15th century weapon, likely of Italian origin, the handle carved from bone with exquisite detail, and the blade itself forged of Toledo steel. Quite irreplaceable." The empty space seemed to breathe unease into the room, its absence louder than any relic present. I could almost feel the weight of that missing dagger, as though its disappearance left not only a gap in the display, but in the very heart of the mystery itself. Poirot bent over the glass display with his usual meticulous care, studying not just the absence of the dagger, but the lock itself, the hinges, and the arrangement of the surviving weapons. His green eyes moved deliberately, weighing every detail with a patience that was almost reverent. I found myself struck by the surrounding arsenal, each weapon gleaming with silent menace, each piece a relic steeped in history and violence. "This case, it is secured each evening?" Poirot asked without lifting his gaze. Mrs. Whitmore clasped her hands tightly before her. "Yes, always. I lock it myself without fail. Dr. Thorne is equally firm about security. A family treasures these artifacts like sacred heirlooms." "And the keys?" Poirot's voice was soft, yet it carried weight. Her hands fluttered again, betraying the nerves that rattled her composure. "Several, I'm afraid. Each family member has one, as do I, Dr. Thorne, and Jenkins. On occasion, visiting scholars require access as well. It is unavoidable that multiple keys exist." Poirot inclined his head thoughtfully. "And when, madame, did you last see the dagger in its rightful place?" 3 days before the murder. I conducted my weekly inventory then, and everything was perfectly in order. She paused, fingers adjusting her spectacles in a nervous, habitual motion. But I should note, there were no signs of tampering, no forced entry. Whoever removed it must have used a key. Poirot crouched closer, his gaze falling to the velvet recess where the weapon once lay. With delicate precision, he indicated faint abrasions along the lining. Observe, Hastings, the scratches. They suggest the dagger was not wrenched away, but lifted out with extraordinary care. This was not the act of desperation, but of deliberation. Whoever stole it intended from the beginning that this dagger, and no other, should serve their purpose. His words lingered in the still air of the gallery like a quiet verdict. The missing weapon had not been chosen in a moment of passion. It had been plotted, secured, and hidden away until the appointed hour. As our inspection drew to a close, Nigel Grimsby appeared in the doorway. He looked worse than the day before. His tailored suit was hastily thrown on, the cuffs uneven, his collar loose. A tremor shook his hands as he spoke without pleasantries. "Monsieur Poirot, I found something in my brother Crispin's study. Letters, unpleasant ones. You'd better see them yourself." He led us down the corridor, into Sir Crispin's private study. A masculine chamber steeped in authority and memory. Heavy leather-bound books lined the shelves, their spines worn by generations of touch. At the room's center stood an imposing mahogany desk, its polished surface still holding the faint, lingering aroma of pipe tobacco. The atmosphere was not merely that of a study, but of a ghost. Crispin's presence clung to the air like smoke that refused to fade. Nigel cleared his throat and laid a small bundle of letters on the desk, tied together with a length of black ribbon that seemed to echo their ominous contents. His fingers trembled slightly as he loosened the knot. "I was sorting through Crispin's correspondence," he explained quietly. "These have been arriving over the past several weeks. I fear they are of a threatening nature." I leaned forward as he unfolded the first sheet. The handwriting was neat, educated, yet the words dripped with menace. The letters accused Sir Crispin of betraying the working classes, condemned him for what they called exploitation of the people, and grew bolder with each page. Explicit warnings of retribution, of punishment to come. "Good Lord," I exclaimed, after reading only a few lines. "This is the work of some radical agitator. One of those socialist firebrands stirring unrest in the towns, no doubt." Nigel nodded quickly, almost with relief. "That was my thought as well, Hastings. Crispin had been under pressure for some time over certain business ventures. Some people objected to his involvement with the factories. He mentioned it often. Poirot, however, did not appear entirely convinced. He bent over the letters with his magnifying glass, examining every curve of the script, every texture of the paper. His eyes narrowed with that quiet intensity I had come to recognize. "These threats, they are grave," he admitted. "But look closer, mon ami. The hand that penned them. See how steady, how disciplined? This is not the scrawl of a hot-headed revolutionary. No, this belongs to someone educated, deliberate, controlled. I frowned, still clinging to my belief in the agitator theory, but Poirot had already shifted his focus. He turned to the piles of ledgers and documents on Crispin's desk, scanning the columns of figures with meticulous care. "Tell me, Monsieur Nigel," he asked, "the estate's finances, they are as precarious as these records suggest?" A flush crept up Nigel's neck, his voice tightening. "Worse, I'm afraid. Much worse." Crispin had been exploring drastic measures, selling portions of the land, even the possibility of letting the entire estate fall into the hands of industrial developers. His final words dropped almost to a whisper, as though uttering them aloud gave them too much power. The thought struck me with genuine horror. Grimswood Grange, this ancient seat, rich with memory and tradition, reduced to little more than a commodity for factory builders? The very idea felt like sacrilege. It was then that Dr. Thorne entered, a slim, leather-bound volume cradled in his hands. His eyes gleamed with scholarly excitement, his usual restraint overtaken by the thrill of discovery. "I've just remembered something that might be of use," he announced. "This book, Legends and Lore of the Yorkshire Grimsbys, I lent it to someone here only last week. Considering our recent supernatural sightings, I thought it might prove relevant." I leaned over his shoulder and noticed something curious. Many of the passages had been underlined in pencil, and the margins bristled with handwritten notes. Yet the script was unlike Dr. Thorne's neat, scholarly hand. "Most instructive," Poirot murmured, his eyes narrowing as he traced the unfamiliar annotations with one delicate fingertip. "Doctor, these notes, they are not yours, n'est-ce pas?" Dr. Thorne adjusted his spectacles, peering closer before shaking his head firmly. "Oh no, certainly not. Someone else has been quite diligent, though. Whoever borrowed this book must have been studying the Grey Lady legend and the tower's architecture with remarkable focus. Very thorough research indeed." Poirot closed the volume halfway, his gaze fixed on Thorne. "And you lent this book, Doctor? To whom?" The historian's brow furrowed as he searched his memory, his expression tightening with frustration. "I know it was to someone in the household. That much I can swear. But which member precisely, I cannot recall. My memory for such trivialities is not what it once was, I'm afraid." The admission hung in the air, like a puzzle piece, dropped just out of reach. As we returned to our rooms that evening, my thoughts tangled themselves into a knot of contradictions. The threatening letters seemed, to my mind, to point clearly toward an outside enemy, a bitter agitator from the industrial towns. Yet Poirot's attention lingered stubbornly on internal family matters, borrowed books, and ghostly legends. At last, I could not hold back my frustration. "I say, Poirot," I pressed as we settled into our sitting room, "surely those letters provide the motive we've been searching for. Some revolutionary bent on punishing Sir Crispin for his so-called capitalist crimes. It seems plain enough." Poirot looked at me then, his expression carrying that unmistakable blend of patience and certainty I had come to recognize in his moments of deepest clarity. "Mon ami, oui, the letters are threatening, but ask yourself, why would a revolutionary from the industrial towns choose such a method? A locked tower? A medieval dagger? A murder staged beneath the shadow of a ghost story? He leaned forward, his green eyes glowing with quiet intensity. This is not the hand of political rage. No, this crime, so theatrical, so carefully staged, speaks not of ideology, but of something far more personal. It is a message, Hastings, but not one addressed to the masses. Non, it is meant for this family alone. Chapter 6, Secrets of the Grey Lady, discover next. By the fourth morning at Grimswood Grange, my patience was wearing thin. Poirot's methods, as brilliant as they were, felt maddeningly indirect. While I remained convinced that we were facing either some sinister outside enemy, or worse, supernatural forces, the threatening letters seemed to me proof enough. Yet Poirot, with his maddening calm, continued to dig into the smallest, most trivial details of household life, as if they held the key to everything. Over breakfast, I finally lost my restraint. "Poirot," I burst out, "surely our attention ought to be on those revolutionary letters, or at least the ghostly manifestations. Even the local police have been baffled by the supernatural elements." He looked up serenely from his toast, spreading marmalade with almost surgical precision. "Ah, mon ami, you wish Poirot to chase the ghosts, n'est-ce pas? Very well. Today we shall investigate these supernatural phenomena most thoroughly." I nearly choked on my tea in surprise. I had expected him to dismiss the folklore as peasant nonsense. Instead, he suggested we visit the village to gather accounts of the Grey Lady. And so, to my astonishment, off we went. The village of Grimswood sat barely 2 miles from the estate, a cluster of weathered stone cottages huddled around an ancient church and a lone coaching inn. The people greeted us with that particular Yorkshire blend of guarded reserve and keen curiosity, though Poirot's reputation had clearly reached them before we did. At the Swan and Crown, we met Mrs. Martha Fielding, the innkeeper's wife, a stout woman with quick eyes and a taste for drama. She placed 2 pints of ale before us, leaned in with relish, and declared, "The Grey Ladies walked them battlements for nigh on 4 centuries. My grandmother swore she saw her twice, and my mother once, back in the terrible winter of '47. Poirot inclined his head, listening intently. "Most fascinating, madame. And the more recent sightings? Tell me, what exactly did the witnesses observe?" Mrs. Fielding's voice dropped, thick with satisfaction. "Clear as daylight, they say. A tall figure in flowing gray, gliding along the tower's high level. Not walking, mind you, floating. Always she comes when tragedy's about to fall on the Grimsby family. Her dress? Gray as a Yorkshire sky. Some call it a burial shroud. Others say an old-fashioned gown. But always gray, always drifting in the wind." And so it went. We gathered similar accounts from several villagers, each with their own flavor of embellishment. Yet through all the stories, the same details repeated. The gray garments, the floating motion, the figure haunting the battlements. What caught my attention was the pattern, the eerie consistency across generations. But Poirot, I noticed, cared less for the ghostly image and more for specifics. When the figure appeared, what exactly was described, and how each witness told it. To me, it was a legend reborn with every retelling. To Poirot, it was data. Old Tom Bradshaw, The village's oldest resident at 83 turned out to be a treasure trove of memory. His weathered face carried the weight of decades, but his eyes still burned with the sharpness of someone who had seen much and remembered more. "Aye, seen her myself, I did. Just 3 nights ago," he said, his voice steady, not the tremble of an old man, but the certainty of one who knows what he saw. "Was walking back from me daughter's cottage when I spotted her, clear as daylight against the pale stone. Moved like mist she did, but not drifty, no, purposeful, like she knew where she was bound. And the time? Oh, I remember it exact. Just past 10 o'clock. Church bells had finished their striking when she came into view." His words clung to me as we returned to Grimswood Grange, echoing in my mind, like those bells he had described. Yet when we reached the estate, I found Poirot not in any tower or shadowy corridor, but in Sir Crispin's study, hunched over the man's papers with renewed intensity. The great detective was less concerned with phantoms and more with ink, figures, and contracts. Across the polished mahogany desk, the documents lay scattered, like a confession waiting to be pieced together. As I picked up one particularly heavy sheaf, my breath caught. "Good heavens, Poirot!" I exclaimed, holding the paper to the light. "Look at this! Preliminary agreements for the sale of Grimswood Grange to Hartwell Industrial Enterprises, dated just last month." Poirot took the contract with the same care he might afford a priceless artifact, scanning every line with deliberate precision. He gave a small nod, his mustache twitching ever so slightly. "Most illuminating, Hastings. It appears Sir Crispin was indeed considering drastic remedies for his financial troubles." An hour later, Nigel entered the study, and I could scarcely contain my alarm. The moment he laid eyes on the papers, the blood drained from his face so swiftly that I thought he might faint. He staggered to the nearest chair, clutching its arm as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. "Sale agreements," he whispered hoarsely. "Crispin, my own brother, was negotiating to sell Grimswood Grange, and without a word to me?" The anguish in his voice was raw, almost childlike, as if the betrayal cut deeper than the threat of ruin itself. I hesitated, loath to wound him further, yet the truth pressed too heavily on my conscience. "I'm afraid the documents are quite clear, Nigel," I said gently, though the words felt cruel even as I spoke them. "Preliminary negotiations with industrial developers." Hartwell was circling. The silence that followed was heavier than any ghostly legend. This was no apparition from folklore, no mist-shrouded figure on the battlements. This was cold ink on paper, proof that the very soul of Grimswood Grange had been put on the bargaining table. The proposed sale price was no small sum, yet Nigel's voice carried none of the relief that wealth might bring. Instead, it was hollow, raw with despair. A fortune, yes, but at what cost? 21 generations of Grimby blood, and it would all vanish into smoke. Factories, chimneys, and workers' tenements. Everything our family stood for, reduced to soot and brick. As he spoke, I watched the revelation weigh upon him like lead, etching lines of grief into his face. It was as though the years descended on him in a single moment. His hands, once steady, shook so violently that he struggled even to strike a match for his cigarette. The Nigel I knew, the man of composure, polish, and well-tailored elegance, now appeared frayed, as if the very fabric of his being had come undone. Poirot, ever the picture of patient precision, leaned forward slightly. His voice, calm yet probing, carried its familiar undercurrent of compassion. "And your brother, Sir Crispin, he never confided any of this to you?" Nigel exhaled a plume of smoke that trembled as much as his hand. "Nothing. He spoke, yes, of pressures, financial storms on the horizon, of choices that might soon become unavoidable. But this, his voice cracked under the weight of the truth. To sell Grimswood, to end centuries of heritage with one signature, I never imagined such betrayal." The silence that followed was broken by the soft rustle of fabric at the doorway. Serafina had entered. She carried herself with that same ethereal grace she always did, though the shadows beneath her eyes betrayed nights robbed of sleep. She paused, surveying the scene. Nigel slumped in despair, Poirot steady in his inquiry, myself caught between grief and shock. Her voice, low but firm, carried both concern and resignation. "Nigel, you look dreadful. What has happened?" We explained the discovery, laying bare the documents and what they implied. I braced myself for an outburst of disbelief, perhaps tears of outrage. But her reaction unsettled me far more than anger would have. There was no shock, only a quiet, resigned sadness, as if this was a truth she had long suspected, yet prayed would remain hidden. It struck me then. For some in this household, the end of Grimswood had never been a matter of if, but merely when. I suspected as much. Serafina admitted at last, her voice low but steady. She lowered herself into the chair near the window, with a grace that seemed instinctive, though the faint tremor in her hands betrayed the toll of sleepless nights. The fading light caught the curve of her face, softening the sadness etched there. "Crispin had grown increasingly distant in recent months," she continued. "He spent endless hours locked away with his papers, surrounded by correspondence. Whenever I asked, he dismissed me with vague assurances, only that difficult decisions lay ahead. Beyond that, he said nothing." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his tone as direct as ever. "You were not happy in your marriage, madam." For a heartbeat, Serafina's composure cracked, her eyes flickering with something raw. Pain, perhaps, or regret. Then she gathered herself with quiet dignity. "Happiness, monsieur, is a luxury I no longer expect of marriage. Crispin was a good man in his way, but our lives diverged. He was consumed by duty, by debt, by the crushing weight of family obligations. And I," her voice softened, almost breaking, "I became little more than a shadow in my own home, a ghost wandering these halls without meaning." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Hence your evening walks?" "Yes," she nodded. "They were my only refuge. To step outside, breathe the cold night air, feel the earth beneath my feet. It was freedom, however brief, an escape from expectations that pressed in from every side. The burden of duty, the slow decline of all we once were." As the afternoon wore on, the full scope of the Grimsby family's decline became clearer still. Mounting debts, dwindling revenues, and a heritage too costly to maintain had forced Sir Crispin into desperate calculations. What had once been unthinkable, selling land, even the ancestral home, had now become a grim reality. And yet, through every revelation, Poirot remained infuriatingly calm. His questions cut like a surgeon's scalpel, precise and exacting, not about emotions or legacies, but about hours, movements, details. Each query seemed almost trivial, yet I knew that in his mind, these fragments formed the outline of something larger. By evening, we gathered once more in the drawing room. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the faces of ancestors immortalized in oil. They stared down from the walls with stern expressions, as though silently condemning the weakness of their descendants. The room felt heavy with history, as if centuries of expectation pressed down on us all. 21 generations, Nigel whispered, his voice thick with despair. He stood before a portrait of his forebears, his shoulders bowed beneath invisible weight. And I am the one who will see it end. Everything they built, everything they preserved, gone. Outside, the autumn wind clawed at the windows, rattling the panes as though echoing his turmoil. The shadows lengthened and danced across the portraits, making the painted eyes seem almost alive in their judgment. In the distance, the church bells tolled the hour, their solemn voices carrying over the darkening Yorkshire fields, as they had done for centuries, reminding us that time, tradition, and fate move on, indifferent to human despair. Chapter 7. The Trap in the Tower. The fifth evening of our stay at Grimswood Grange descended beneath a shroud of tension so thick it was almost tangible. A strange unease had settled over the household, stretching like an invisible net across every corridor. I could not help but notice how conversations faltered into silence the moment Poirot or myself entered a room. Whispers died, eyes turned away, and the heavy air seemed to guard secrets yet unspoken. Even Jenkins, the imperturbable valet whose composure usually rivaled a soldier on parade, betrayed signs of strain. His hands, normally steady as a clockmaker's, fumbled with trivial tasks, and there was a faint tremor in his voice when he addressed us. For a man of such habitual discipline, this subtle crack revealed far more than words. It was Dr. Thorne, however, who delivered the revelation that shook the case open once more. He burst into the library where Poirot and I were bent over the annotated volume of the Legends of the Grimsbys, his spectacles slipping down his nose, his face flushed with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. "Mr. Poirot," he exclaimed breathlessly, "the most extraordinary thing has occurred. She has returned. The Grey Lady has been seen again." A chill ran the length of my spine at his words, cold and electric. "Again?" I demanded, my voice catching in my throat. "Where? When?" "Not 10 minutes ago," Thorne replied, struggling to steady himself. "I was working in my study when I heard Mrs. Whitmore cry out from the museum. She was cataloging some recent acquisitions late into the evening. When she glanced toward the windows overlooking the tower, she saw the figure, the Grey Lady, moving as clear as day across the glass. Without hesitation, we accompanied him to the museum wing. There, in the lamplight's glow, we found poor Mrs. Whitmore seated with a teacup clutched in both hands. Her complexion was the color of parchment, drained of all vitality, and the trembling of her fingers rattled porcelain against the saucer with every breath. "Oh, Mr. Poirot," she gasped when she saw him, her eyes wide with lingering terror. It was the most dreadful, most terrifying sight I have ever witnessed. She was there, floating past the windows as though the air itself carried her. Not a dream, not a shadow. I swear it upon my soul. Her words, whispered with quivering conviction, hung in the room like smoke. I glanced toward Poirot, but his expression remained unreadable, calm, contemplative, as though the testimony of a spectral figure was no more disturbing to him than a weather report. And yet I knew, from the sharp gleam in his eyes, that every detail was being filed, weighed, and measured with that uncanny precision of his little gray cells. I had been quietly arranging the medieval manuscripts, losing myself in the fragile pages, when a flicker of movement outside the window froze me in place. My eyes lifted, and there she was, against the weathered stone of the tower, as clear as day, drifted the figure I had heard spoken of in hushed whispers, the Grey Lady. "Madam," Poirot asked gently, "you are certain of what you saw?" "Perfectly certain," Mrs. Whitmore insisted, her voice trembling with conviction. A tall figure, clothed in flowing gray garments, moving along the battlements with that uncanny floating grace. I watched her for 3, perhaps 4 minutes before she faded, simply melted away into nothing. What startled me most was that she was not the only witness. From opposite wings of the house, both Serafina and Nigel had also glimpsed the same apparition, each from their own vantage point. Their accounts matched in every detail: the gray drapery, the spectral motion, the location near the upper tower. The stories aligned too precisely for coincidence. "This settles the matter," I declared, my own voice betraying a mixture of awe and dread. "We are clearly in the presence of something beyond the ordinary, a true visitation. The Grey Lady has returned, surely to claim vengeance for some ancient injustice." To my astonishment, Poirot did not scoff at the notion as I had fully expected. Instead, he placed his fingertips together, eyes narrowing with uncharacteristic solemnity. Then, with a deliberate calmness, he spoke words that chilled me more than the apparition itself. "Mon ami Hastings," he said, "if the Grey Lady wishes to show herself, then I shall give her the chance to do so in earnest. Tonight, I will spend the evening in the Bloody Tower. Perhaps this ghost and we shall have a little conversation, n'est-ce pas?" "Poirot," I cried, aghast. "You cannot be serious. That tower is cursed, haunted, after what befell poor Sir Crispin." He lifted a hand, silencing me with quiet authority. "My friend, it is in that tower the truth resides. And tonight, Hercule Poirot shall uncover it." The declaration sent ripples of alarm through the entire household. Nigel was the first to protest, his face pale with fear. "It is madness, Poirot, sheer madness. You cannot endanger yourself so recklessly," Serafina pleaded, her voice breaking as she begged him to reconsider. Even Jenkins, whose reserve was rarely cracked, allowed his unease to show. It was Dr. Thorne, however, who gave voice to what we were all thinking. He leaned forward, his tone earnest, his scholar's mind caught between fascination and fear. Mr. Poirot, I have studied the Grey Lady legend for 2 decades. She appears only when calamity threatens this family. To seek her out deliberately, it is to invite catastrophe upon yourself, and perhaps upon us all. But Poirot remained unmoved, his decision set like stone. His eyes gleamed with that peculiar mixture of logic and quiet daring that defined him. The investigation, he said firmly, has come to its turning point. Words, whispers, shadows, they are no longer enough. The time has come for direct action. Tonight, my friends, tonight, the truth shall reveal itself. Despite my fervent objections, and even my offer to join him, Poirot remained adamant. No, no, Hastings. The Grey Lady, she is, how do you say, shy. With too many witnesses, she will vanish like smoke. But Poirot, alone? Ah, that is different. His certainty unnerved me, but nothing I said could shake his resolve. As night descended over Grimswood Grange, I watched, with tightening unease, while my friend made his peculiar preparations. He packed his ever-present magnifying glass, a small electric torch, and a curious collection of odds and ends I had long since learned not to question. But tonight, there was something new. From his case, he produced a tiny glass vial of fine powder and several crisp sheets of white paper. What on earth are those for, Poirot? I asked, baffled. He only gave me that enigmatic smile of his, tapped the side of his nose, and said nothing. Then came the moment I will never forget. Poirot, small yet steady, striding across the moonlit lawn toward the tower. Against the vast backdrop of that brooding stone fortress, his figure looked almost fragile, ridiculously vulnerable even. And yet he moved with the calm precision of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. I could not bring myself to leave him unwatched. From the library window, which gave the clearest view of the tower, I stationed myself as silent sentinel. The rest of the household had retired to their rooms, though I doubted any among them truly slept. For who could close their eyes, knowing Poirot was keeping vigil in the cursed tower? The first hour passed in silence. The tower loomed like a shadow carved into the star-strewn heavens, still and unyielding. No flicker of light, no stir of movement, no ghostly apparition gliding through the battlements. Only the whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the ancient house broke the stillness. But as the warmth of the library fire pressed in around me, and the comfort of the armchair beckoned, I felt the weight of drowsiness tugging at my eyelids. An unworthy battle began within me, my loyalty demanding I stay alert, my weary body begging surrender to sleep. And all the while, in that darkened tower, my friend Poirot waited, alone. It was a little after 11 when I first heard it, a cry, faint and distant, carried on the night air from the direction of the tower. My breath caught, every nerve in me taut with dread. For a moment, the silence closed back in, heavy and absolute, leaving me to wonder if my imagination had conjured the sound. But then, 20 minutes later, it came again. this time sharper, human, undeniable. What followed chilled me to the marrow. The muffled sounds of a struggle, shuffling, a stifled gasp, the raw echoes of conflict reverberating across the still grounds. My pulse hammered in my ears. I could not endure the uncertainty another second. Snatching a torch from the library desk, I dashed out into the night, my legs carrying me faster than my thoughts. The image that haunted me was all too clear. Poirot, trapped and helpless, falling victim to the same dark force that had claimed Sir Crispin. The tower loomed ahead, stark against the moonlit sky, its ancient stones etched in cold silver. The heavy door stood wide open, yawning like the mouth of some waiting beast. My stomach tightened with dread at the sight. "Poirot!" I shouted as I reached the entrance. No reply. I stepped inside, the beam of my torch cutting across the circular chamber where Sir Crispin had once met his grisly fate. Nothing stirred. The silence pressed in, echoing my own ragged breathing. "Poirot!" I called again, my voice ricocheting off the stone walls, hollow and accusing. Then, to my immense relief, came that familiar, precise voice from above. "Ah, Hastings, ever punctual, my friend. Do come up, though carefully if you please. The stairs are most treacherous in such darkness." I nearly sagged with relief, though my knees still trembled. Climbing the narrow, winding stairway, I found him at last on the battlements, standing in a wash of moonlight, as though he had been waiting all along. He was perfectly composed, though his usually impeccable appearance bore small betrayals of exertion. His jacket hung slightly askew, and a dusting of grit clung to his trousers. But his eyes, those sharp, meticulous eyes, glimmered with the light of discovery. "Good Lord, Poirot!" I exclaimed, breathless. "I heard cries, a struggle. What happened?" He gave a small, knowing smile and gestured to the object in his hand. "Mais oui, Hastings. The Grey Lady and I, we have had our meeting, most enlightening, though not perhaps in the manner our witnesses imagined." He raised it for me to see, a small scrap of fabric, pale and delicate, glinting faintly in the moonlight. "Observe this, Hastings." Poirot held up the scrap of fabric, his eyes glittering with quiet triumph. It was caught upon a jagged stone during our little encounter. And here, he gestured toward his magnifying glass, already laid out beside a crisp sheet of white paper, we have traces most intriguing. I frowned, baffled. "Traces? Poirot, what on earth are you talking about?" He leaned closer, lowering his voice, as if sharing some great secret. "A perfume, mon ami. A modern fragrance, sharp, distinctive. And I ask you, does one expect a 16th century phantom to wear such a scent?" I blinked at him, utterly bewildered. "You mean to suggest the Grey Lady is not supernatural?" Poirot's lips curved into that maddening little smile of his. "Not supernatural, Hastings, but very real, and, I believe, directly entangled with the death of Sir Crispin." Before I could press him further, he guided me to a section of the battlements. At first, it appeared indistinguishable from the rest. Yet under Poirot's meticulous eye, details emerged. Stone worn smoother than its neighbors, faint scratches where no weather should have marked them, and, most telling of all, the outline of a mechanism half concealed in shadow. You see, mon ami? Always it is in the details that the truth hides. A ghost leaves no scratches, no scent of modern perfume, no torn fabric, but a living hand. That is another matter entirely. As we descended from the tower and made our way back across the grounds, I noticed a particular satisfaction in his manner, the quiet assurance of a man who had, at last, placed the final piece in a complicated puzzle. The wind had risen, autumn leaves skittering along the path, clouds sweeping swiftly across the moon and casting restless shadows upon the ancient walls. But in my mind, I felt something else shifting. The darker shadows. The shadows of deceit, of fear, of mystery that had hung over Grimswood Grange were beginning at last to lift beneath Poirot's relentless, methodical light. Chapter 8. The Truth Behind the Grey Lady. The following evening, we assembled in the library. By now, I had grown accustomed to the ritual, the great gathering of anxious faces, the heavy hush of anticipation, and Poirot himself standing at the center like an actor awaiting his cue. It was clear that tonight the curtain would finally rise on the true story behind the Grey Lady. The entire household had assembled, summoned as if to a tribunal. Nigel and Seraphina sat close to the fireplace, shadows flickering across their weary faces. Dr. Thorne occupied his familiar chair, surrounded by stacks of scholarly tomes that seemed to lend him strength. Jenkins, ever the embodiment of discipline, stood silently by the door, while Mrs. Whitmore perched nervously on the edge of a straight-backed chair, twisting her handkerchief in pale fingers. At the center of it all stood Poirot. He had arranged himself with almost ceremonial precision, his posture erect, hands clasped behind his back. His gray eyes shone with that peculiar gleam I had come to recognize, the light of certainty, the quiet satisfaction of a man about to reveal the truth. "Mes amis," he began, his voice calm yet commanding, "we are confronted with a puzzle that appears to defy reason. A man slain within a locked tower, ghostly apparitions witnessed by several among you, a crime cloaked in the trappings of vengeance from beyond the grave. And yet, I tell you this, there are no spirits in this matter, only human hearts, human passions, and very human hands." A ripple passed through the room. Nigel looked especially stricken, his features haggard, his hands trembling as he fumbled for a cigarette. Seraphina reached for his arm, but he scarcely seemed aware of her. Poirot's voice did not waver. "Let us begin with the so-called locked room mystery that so confounded the police. A tower, sealed from within. Windows far too narrow for passage. No door left unfastened. And yet, someone entered, committed murder, and departed without trace. How is this possible?" He moved slowly toward the fireplace, his small figure somehow dominating the grand room. His words fell with the inevitability of stones dropped into water. "The answer, mes amis, lies not in phantoms, but in architecture, medieval architecture. During my vigil in the tower last night, I uncovered what the builders of 1380 sought to conceal. A secret passage, a hidden way linking the tower to the main house, its entrance disguised within the battlements. Dr. Thorne sat forward, eyes alight with scholarly fervor. A secret passage? But I have studied the tower's construction for 20 years. I found nothing of the sort. Poirot inclined his head politely. Just so, Doctor. But you studied as a historian, not as a detective. Your eye sought patterns of history, not the small betrayals of stone. To me, the signs were clear. Scratches where hands had pressed, smoothness where stone had been touched too often. And here, he reached into his pocket and produced the pale fragment of fabric, holding it delicately between finger and thumb. This scrap, caught upon the stonework during my encounter with the so-called Grey Lady, evidence not of a ghost, but of a living conspirator. The apparitions that terrified this household were no supernatural visitations. They were deliberate illusions, performed by someone who knew your legends well and who possessed intimate knowledge of this house's secret bones. He let the words hang in the air. The fire snapped sharply in the hearth. Every eye in the room remained fixed on Poirot, waiting for the truth to come tumbling out at last. Seraphina's face drained of color, pale as moonlight on fresh snow. "You mean to suggest," she whispered, "that someone deliberately manufactured these ghostly sightings?" "Just so, madame," Poirot replied softly, his tone both firm and compassionate. "Someone with cleverness enough to recognize that the legend of the Grey Lady could serve as the perfect disguise for a crime most earthly in nature. The so-called ghostly appearances were not random. They were orchestrated, carefully staged, timed to perfection. Each sighting served a purpose: to confuse, to mislead, to cloak the hand of a murderer beneath a veil of superstition. I leaned forward, unable to contain myself. But Poirot, the Grey Lady was seen by so many. Mrs. Whitmore, Dr. Thorne, even the villagers in the town. Poirot's eyes sparkled with that maddening calm that always preceded revelation. Precisely, Hastings. That is the brilliance of it. The sightings were real, but the figure was not a phantom. It was flesh and blood. Someone in a flowing gray garment, positioned just so upon the battlements, knowing exactly when to be seen and by whom. That was the trick. His gaze shifted, gentle yet unyielding, until it rested on Seraphina. She flinched beneath its weight. "Madame Grimby, you once mentioned that during your evening walks, you often wore your gray cashmere shawl. A beautiful garment indeed, but under the silver glow of the moon, from a distance, it would appear almost spectral." Seraphina's lips trembled. I don't understand what you mean to imply." Poirot's voice softened, but his words struck with precision. "I imply that someone, perhaps under the guise of affection, perhaps in the spirit of a harmless jest, requested that you take your stroll across the battlements that night. And you, innocent of their intent, complied. Wrapped in your gray shawl, you became the phantom. Without knowing it, madam, you provided the ghostly illusion that so many claimed to witness. A chill rippled through me as realization dawned with awful clarity. Good Lord, you mean she was used as an unwitting accomplice? Exactement. Poirot inclined his head. While Madame Serafina supplied the illusion of the Grey Lady, the true murderer seized the opportunity. Through the hidden passage, they entered the tower, struck down Sir Crispin with the stolen dagger, and escaped unseen. The so-called locked room mystery was nothing more than clever stagecraft, smoke and mirrors, as you English say. Nigel's face turned ashen, his cigarette burning to ash between trembling fingers. His voice cracked as he tried to protest. "This is nothing but conjecture, Monsieur Poirot. You have no proof." Poirot's eyes gleamed with quiet certainty. "Ah, but I do, monsieur. Proof most damning. To begin with, an annotated volume. A certain book that Dr. Thorne once lent to a member of this household. Its margins bear detailed notes on the legend of the Grey Lady, and most revealing of all, references to the secret passage in the tower. Someone studied both the myth and the architecture most intently, and then used that knowledge to cloak their crime in shadows." Poirot held up the final piece of evidence, his tone calm but merciless. "The handwriting, mon ami, when compared with your personal correspondence, it reveals everything." Dr. Thorne's eyes widened as the realization struck him. He turned sharply toward Nigel. "You borrowed my book? All this time? But why not simply ask me about the legends? I would have told you anything you wished to know." Poirot answered for him, his voice low and deliberate. "Because, Doctor, Monsieur Nigel required secrecy. He could not risk questions, not when he intended to twist those legends into tools for murder. He studied in silence, so as not to arouse suspicion." Poirot's hand swept toward the small evidence laid out before us. "Second, we have the matter of chemistry. The traces I collected in the tower. Ah, they tell a story. Not some medieval fragrance, no. A modern perfume, unmistakable, ode to Colonia, the very scent Madame Sonnel favors." Nigel's lips parted, his voice breaking to little more than a whisper. That is circumstantial, Poirot." "Perhaps," Poirot murmured, stepping closer. "But then we come to the physical proof." His gray eyes fixed on Nigel with quiet finality. "Your cufflink, the left one. It carries the dust of limestone unique to the secret passage linking the tower and the main house. Dust that could only cling to a man who had walked that hidden way." I could scarcely breathe as I watched Nigel's defenses collapse. His proud posture crumbled. His shoulders bowed as though under some great invisible weight. The cigarette slipped from his fingers and smoldered on the carpet. Poirot's voice softened, though the truth he spoke cut like a blade. "And the motive, monsieur, was not greed. It was love, tragically distorted into obsession. You loved your family's heritage, yes, but when you learned your brother intended to sell Grimswood Grange to the developers, you saw only betrayal. 21 generations of legacy reduced to mere currency. You could not endure it." Nigel's voice cracked, raw with anguish. "He would have destroyed everything, centuries of history, reduced to smoke and factories. I could not let it happen." Poirot shook his head, his tone almost mournful. And so you planned the perfect crime. You stole the ceremonial dagger. You studied the family legends, weaving superstition into your design. You persuaded your sister-in-law, unwittingly, to provide the ghostly distraction. And through the secret passage known only to the Grimsbys, you entered the locked tower. There, you struck down your brother and escaped unseen. The Grey Lady became your mask, your shield, ensuring that all eyes would chase shadows instead of truth. Silence fell upon the room, heavy, suffocating. At last, Jenkins, ever the soldier, moved with quiet dignity to stand behind Nigel's chair, ready to fulfill his grim duty. Nigel bowed his head, his voice hollow, stripped of defiance. I only wanted to preserve our heritage, but instead, I have destroyed it more completely than any factory could have. As the police were summoned and the bitter machinery of justice began, I found myself reflecting on the cruel irony. In seeking to preserve his family's honor, Nigel Grimsby had brought upon it the greatest disgrace in its history. His name, once bound to legacy and tradition, would forever be chained to scandal and blood. The ancient stones of Grimswood Grange had stood for centuries, keeping the secrets of generations. Yet none, I think, more tragic than this one, a tale of devotion twisted into betrayal, and of heritage preserved only through its own ruin. So ends the case of the murder of Sir Crispin Grimsby. And if you've journeyed with us through haunted towers, family secrets, and the price of obsession, I invite you to stay with us. For mysteries such as these, rich with atmosphere and revelation, are told here daily. Subscribe and let us walk together into the shadows where truth and illusion entwine.